Listen to me now, not with casual ears, but with a heart that knows this moment is not ordinary. Because there are moments when time itself seems to pause, when the noise of the world fades, and a voice greater than fear, greater than confusion, greater than habit, begins to thunder inside the soul. And this is one of those moments. Because God is not whispering to be ignored. God is not suggesting to be debated. God is sounding an emergency alert to awaken those who are willing to hear. And the urgency of this hour presses upon the spirit like a weight that cannot be postponed. Because when God speaks in urgency, delay becomes disobedience and complacency becomes danger. There are seasons when God allows humanity to move at its own pace, and then there are moments when God interrupts that pace with a divine alarm, a sacred disruption that declares, this is not business as usual, this is not another cycle, this is not another calendar page to be torn away and forgotten. This is a moment marked by heaven, and the message is clear in its urgency, because January 7th, January 8th, and January 9 to 10 stand not merely as dates, but as a window of awakening, a spiritual emergency alert that demands attention from every heart that still trembles at the authority of God. Too many have grown comfortable with distance, comfortable with routine prayers, comfortable with borrowed faith and second-hand conviction. But God is not interested in comfort when destiny is at stake. And God does not raise an alarm to entertain curiosity, because an emergency alert exists for one reason alone: to save, to warn, to prepare, and to realign what has drifted out of order. And this alert is not meant to produce fear, but to produce clarity, not panic, but purpose, not despair, but decisive action rooted in faith. God has always spoken before great shifts, before collapse, before restoration, before judgment, before renewal, because silence is not the language of a loving God, and indifference is not the posture of divine authority. And when God speaks with urgency, it is because time has become precious and choices have become consequential. And the days of casual faith have expired, because God is calling for a people who do not merely believe in concept, but who respond in action, alignment, and obedience. Hear this with gravity, because God is not sounding this alert to the world in general, but to individuals in particular, to hearts that have been drifting, to minds clouded by distraction, to souls numbed by compromise, because God always begins transformation one life at a time. And when enough hearts respond, history bends. But when hearts refuse, consequences follow, not because God is cruel, but because God is just, and justice ignored becomes judgment experienced. January 7th is not random. It represents awakening, the moment when the eyes of the soul are forced open, when denial loses its grip, when excuses crumble under the weight of truth, because God is calling people to wake up from spiritual sleep, to rise from passivity, to recognize that what was tolerated yesterday can no longer be entertained today. An awakening is painful because it demands honesty. And honesty is uncomfortable for those who have learned to survive on illusion. January 8th is the day of decision, because awakening without decision produces frustration, and revelation without response produces condemnation of conscience. And God does not reveal truth merely to inform, but to transform. And transformation requires a decision that costs something, because obedience always demands the surrender of what competes with God for authority in the heart. And many want blessing without surrender, direction without discipline, favor without faithfulness. But God does not negotiate with divided loyalty. January 9 to 10 represent alignment and movement, because once awakening has occurred and decision has been made, alignment must follow. And alignment is not emotional excitement, but practical obedience. Not public declarations, but private changes. Not dramatic words, but consistent actions, because God measures faith not by what is said in moments of inspiration, but by what is done when inspiration fades, and discipline must carry the weight of obedience. This emergency alert is not about dates on a calendar, but about posture before God, because God is pressing upon humanity with urgency, saying now is the time to return, now is the time to realign, now is the time to abandon what weakens the soul, because tomorrow is not guaranteed, and delay is a luxury that spiritually blind hearts assume they possess. But God speaks now, because now is when obedience is possible. Do not misunderstand this moment, because God is not threatening, God is inviting. But the invitation carries weight, because invitations from God always come with consequences, and ignoring them has never led to life, and accepting them has never led to regret, because God does not call people into destruction, but into protection, not into fear, but into clarity, not into bondage, but into freedom that only obedience can sustain. There is a shaking in the hearts of those who are sensitive, a stirring that cannot be explained by circumstance alone, because when God moves, the soul recognizes it before the mind understands it. And this stirring is not meant to produce confusion, but conviction, not anxiety, but alignment, because God is drawing lines, separating what is sacred from what is shallow, what is eternal from what is temporary, what is obedient from what is convenient. God is calling people out of spectatorship and into responsibility, because faith that never acts eventually dies, and belief that never obeys eventually deceives. And God is not interested in surface spirituality that sounds impressive but lacks substance, because God sees the heart, measures intention, weighs obedience, and responds accordingly. And in this emergency alert, God is asking one question that echoes through time: who is willing to listen and respond now? This is not the hour for spiritual entertainment, not the season for borrowed conviction, not the moment for delayed obedience, because God is speaking with urgency to those who still believe that obedience matters, that alignment matters, that holiness of heart matters, that integrity of soul matters. Because when God is honored inwardly, outward transformation follows. But when God is ignored inwardly, outward collapse is inevitable. Many are searching for signs, but God is calling for surrender. Many are demanding clarity, but God is asking for trust. Many are waiting for certainty, but God is calling for faith, because certainty follows obedience, clarity follows surrender, and peace follows alignment. And those who insist on having everything explained before responding will remain stuck in cycles of delay that rob them of destiny. This emergency alert is personal, because God does not shout into crowds without addressing individuals, and the voice that speaks to many always whispers to one, because transformation begins in the private chambers of the heart, and public change is always the echo of private obedience. And God is calling individuals to examine their ways, not to judge others, not to measure neighbors, but to look inward and ask whether their lives are aligned with the authority of God. God is calling people to repent of indifference, to turn away from distraction, to abandon compromises that once seemed harmless but have slowly eroded spiritual strength. Because erosion is subtle and decline rarely announces itself loudly, but God exposes it before collapse, because warning is an act of mercy. And this emergency alert is mercy clothed in urgency. Do not assume that silence means approval, because God's patience is not permission, and delay of consequence is not cancellation of truth, because God allows time for repentance, but time is not infinite, and moments of warning are gifts that must be received with humility, because pride dismisses warnings and humility responds to them. This is a call to realign priorities, because God will not be relegated to convenience, will not compete with idols of comfort, success, or self, because God alone holds authority, and divided allegiance weakens the soul. Because you cannot move forward while being pulled backward by attachments that God has already exposed. God is calling for courage because obedience often requires standing alone, changing direction, breaking patterns and resisting pressures. But courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that God's voice matters more than human opinion. And those who honor God openly will experience protection inwardly because obedience builds a fortress around the soul that circumstances cannot penetrate. The emergency alert is also a promise, because God does not warn without providing a path, and does not expose without offering restoration, and does not call without empowering those who respond. Because God supplies strength where obedience is chosen, wisdom where humility is embraced, and peace where surrender is complete. This moment is about alignment with God's timing, because delayed obedience is disobedience disguised as wisdom, and partial surrender is rebellion clothed in spirituality. And God is not deceived by appearances, because God sees motives, weighs intentions, and responds to truth, not performance. Let the heart tremble, not with fear, but with reverence. Because reverence restores perspective, and perspective restores obedience, and obedience restores favor. Because when God is honored, life aligns. But when God is ignored, life fragments. And this emergency alert is God's call to restoration before fragmentation deepens. God is asking for whole-hearted response, not emotional reaction, because emotional reactions fade. But wholehearted decisions transform, and transformation requires endurance, because alignment is maintained daily, not decided once. And God honors consistency over intensity, because intensity impresses people, but consistency honors God. This is not a message for tomorrow, because tomorrow is uncertain. And this is not a message for someone else, because responsibility is personal. And this is not a message to be admired, because admiration without obedience hardens the heart. And God is calling for response now, in this moment, in this awareness, in this awakening. January 7, January 8, and January 9 to 10 stand as a divine alert, not to predict catastrophe, but to prevent spiritual decay. Because God warns before breakdown, calls before collapse, and invites before consequence, because God desires life, alignment, and obedience, not destruction, rebellion, or loss. Those who respond will not be perfect, but they will be positioned, because obedience positions the heart under divine protection, and alignment places the soul within the flow of God's purpose, and purpose releases peace that circumstances cannot steal. God is watching how hearts respond, not to condemn, but to confirm who is willing to move forward. Because destiny is not assigned randomly. It is entrusted to those who demonstrate faith through obedience, humility, and reverence. And this emergency alert is a threshold moment that separates those who hear from those who respond. Let the response be sincere. Let the surrender be complete. Let the alignment be intentional. Because God is faithful to those who honor God, and the consequences of obedience always outweigh the comfort of compromise. And those who respond now will look back and recognize that this moment was not interruption, but invitation. Not warning, but mercy. Not fear, but favor unfolding in obedience. There is a weight in the atmosphere when God calls again, because repetition from heaven is never redundancy, it is insistence. And insistence reveals importance, because God does not repeat what is trivial, and God does not press what is optional. And this continued stirring in the soul is evidence that God is still reaching, still warning, still inviting hearts to step out of numbness and into responsibility. The danger is not that people do not hear. The danger is that they hear and delay slowly trains the heart to ignore conviction until silence feels normal and disobedience feels justified. God is confronting the illusion of control that has quietly replaced dependence, because many have learned to manage life without seeking God's direction, to plan without prayer, to decide without reverence, and to move without listening. And this illusion has produced exhaustion, confusion, and inner emptiness that no achievement can satisfy. God is not exposing this to shame, but to restore order, because life functions best when God is acknowledged as the source, not an accessory. This emergency alert is also a call to spiritual sobriety, because God is asking people to come out of intoxication with distractions, with noise, with constant stimulation that numbs sensitivity to truth. A distracted heart cannot discern urgency, and a divided mind cannot respond with clarity. And God is calling for stillness that leads to awareness, awareness that leads to repentance, and repentance that leads to renewal. God is challenging people to examine what they have normalized that heaven never approved, because compromise rarely begins with rebellion. It begins with tolerance, and tolerance slowly dulls conviction until the extraordinary becomes ordinary and the sacred becomes negotiable. God is restoring the fear of God, not terror, but reverence that realigns behavior, speech, priorities, and desire. Because when reverence returns, wisdom follows. There are those who sense this alert as a warning about internal collapse rather than external crisis, because God often addresses inner erosion before outward failure appears, and inner erosion always precedes visible downfall. God is calling people to repair foundations, to rebuild discipline, to restore devotion, because strong foundations withstand storms, but neglected ones crumble silently. This is also a call to responsibility, because faith is not passive belief, but active trust expressed through obedience. God is not asking for perfection, but for honesty, not for flawless performance, but for surrendered intention. God works with surrendered hearts, not defended excuses, and humility is the doorway through which restoration enters. God is calling leaders to integrity, families to alignment, individuals to accountability, because influence without obedience becomes dangerous, and authority without reverence becomes destructive. God is restoring moral clarity in a time of confusion, reminding hearts that truth does not shift with culture, and righteousness is not defined by popularity, but by obedience. There's also a call to intercession. Not ritual words, but burdened hearts. Because when God releases urgency, it is often an invitation for people to stand in the gap, to pray with seriousness, to seek God with intensity. Because prayer aligns the human will with divine purpose, and aligned prayer releases protection, wisdom, and direction. God is calling people to release bitterness, unresolved anger, pride, and resentment, because these block sensitivity to divine direction, and a hardened heart cannot respond quickly when God speaks urgently. Forgiveness is not weakness, it is alignment, and release is not loss, it is freedom that restores clarity. This alert is also about stewardship of time, because wasted seasons cannot be reclaimed, but redeemed ones can still bear fruit. God is urging people to stop postponing obedience, stop delaying reconciliation, stop ignoring convictions that return again and again, because repeated conviction is mercy, not annoyance. God is speaking to those who feel dry, disconnected, or distant, reminding them that distance is not final and dryness is not defeat, because God restores sensitivity to those who return with sincerity. Revival does not begin with crowds, it begins with one heart that responds fully. There are those who fear change more than disobedience, but God is reminding them that obedience may disrupt comfort, but disobedience destroys peace. Peace is not found in stability, it is found in alignment, and alignment often requires courage to leave what is familiar. God is also addressing hidden fear, because fear silences obedience and paralyzes decision. Fear convinces people to stay where they are, even when God calls them forward. But God has not designed hearts to live under fear, but under trust, because trust releases courage, and courage produces movement. This moment is sacred because God is offering clarity in a world addicted to confusion. Confusion thrives where truth is ignored, but clarity emerges when God is honored. God is not complicated, but obedience often confronts the ego, and the ego resists surrender. God is calling for humility that listens without arguing. God is calling people to remember that destiny is not accidental, it is stewarded, and stewardship requires obedience in small things before authority is given in greater things. Faithfulness in unseen moments prepares hearts for visible responsibility, and God watches what is done in private before entrusting public influence. This alert is also about alignment of speech, because words shape direction, and careless speech reveals careless hearts. God is calling people to speak life, truth, and reverence, because speech aligned with God reinforces obedience and strengthens resolve. God is not finished with those who feel behind, because redemption does not measure by human clocks, but urgency reminds that now is the moment to return. God restores what was lost when hearts turn fully, because restoration is God's nature, not condemnation. This is a moment to listen deeply, respond sincerely, and move decisively, because delayed obedience weakens conviction, but immediate obedience strengthens faith. God is honoring those who choose reverence over rebellion, surrender over self, and alignment over convenience. The alert continues because God continues to care, and God's persistence reveals love that refuses to abandon. Those who respond will not walk alone, because obedience brings companionship with divine guidance, and guidance produces confidence that cannot be shaken by uncertainty. Let the heart respond without negotiation. Let the will align without hesitation. Let the soul return without reservation, because God is faithful, God is just, God is attentive, and God honors those who honor God. And this moment remains open for those who choose to step forward in obedience and reverence while the call still echoes. There is also a deeper lay to this alert that reaches beyond behavior and into identity, because God is not merely correcting actions, God is reclaiming ownership of hearts that have slowly begun to belong to other masters without realizing it. Identity confusion weakens obedience, because when people forget who they belong to, they forget how they are meant to live. God is reminding hearts that they were formed with purpose, shaped with intention, and sustained by divine breath, and no created thing has the authority to redefine what God has established. God is exposing the subtle exchange that has taken place in many lives, where reverence has been traded for familiarity, where awe has been replaced with assumption, where God has been reduced to an option rather than honored as the source. Familiarity breeds casualness, and casualness erodes obedience. And God is restoring holy awareness, not distance, but deep respect that guards the heart from drifting. This alert also speaks to the misuse of strength, because God gives ability to serve purpose, not ego, and gifts to advance good, not self-exaltation. When strength is detached from reverence, it becomes destructive, and when talent is disconnected from obedience, it becomes a trap. God is calling people to realign their abilities under divine authority, because strength submitted becomes power, but strength independent becomes burden. God is also addressing exhaustion, because many are tired not from obedience, but from resistance. Resisting conviction drains the soul. Resisting surrender fractures peace, and resisting truth produces inner conflict that no rest can heal. God's ways are not heavy, resistance is heavy, and surrender releases rest that sleep alone cannot provide. There is a warning within this alert about heart and hearing, because the more often conviction is ignored, the quieter it becomes, not because God stops speaking, but because the heart loses sensitivity. God is calling people to respond while sensitivity remains, because sensitivity is a gift that must be guarded, and those who protect it walk in discernment and clarity. God is restoring spiritual sight, because many have been seeing life only through circumstance, emotion, and opinion, but God offers vision that transcends momentary conditions. When vision is restored, fear loses authority, and when fear loses authority, obedience becomes possible. God does not guide blindly. God illuminates the path for those willing to walk it. This alert also confronts misplaced trust, because many have leaned on systems, resources, and assurances that cannot sustain the soul. God is not against provision, but God opposes replacement. And when provision becomes a substitute for dependence, anxiety follows. Trust placed in God produces stability even when external conditions shake. God is calling people to reestablish sacred boundaries, because boundaries protect what matters. Without boundaries, devotion is diluted, focus is scattered, and obedience is compromised. God is not restrictive, God is protective, and divine boundaries preserve purpose, clarity, and peace. There is also a call to courage in speech, because silence in the face of truth becomes agreement with distortion. God is not asking for aggression, but for conviction rooted in humility, because truth spoken with reverence carries authority, and authority anchored in obedience influences without force. God is reminding hearts that growth often feels uncomfortable, because growth stretches what has become familiar. Comfort resists growth, but obedience embraces it, and God does not waste discomfort when it leads to maturity. Those who endure the stretching emerge with deeper faith and stronger resolve. This moment also exposes misplaced priorities, because what is valued most receives the most attention. God is not competing for attention. God is revealing what attention reveals. Where time, energy, and affection flow shows where allegiance rests, and God is calling people to reorder what has drifted. God is also speaking to those who have been wounded by disappointment, because disappointment unresolved hardens the heart and clouds perception. God heals wounds that are brought honestly, but wounds hidden turn into bitterness. God is inviting honesty that leads to healing, not denial that leads to decay. This alert is an invitation to humility, because humility keeps the heart teachable, responsive, and aligned. Pride resists correction, but humility reckons. Eve's direction, and God guides those who acknowledge their need for guidance. Dependence is not weakness, it is wisdom that opens the door to divine leading. God is also calling for endurance, because obedience is not proven in beginnings, but sustained through persistence. Many start well, but drift when resistance arises. God strengthens those who continue, because perseverance refines faith and deepens trust beyond emotion. There is a reminder here that obedience is not lost but exchanged, because what is surrendered is replaced with something greater. God never takes without giving, never removes without restoring, and never calls away without calling into something better, even if the better is not immediately visible. God is awakening hunger, because hunger precedes movement. A satisfied heart rarely seeks change, but a hungry heart pursues alignment. God is stirring hunger for truth, for righteousness, for clarity, because hunger leads people back to the source of life. This alert also addresses the misuse of mercy, because mercy misunderstood becomes permission to delay. God's mercy is not an excuse to ignore urgency. It is the reason urgency exists. Mercy warns before consequence, and grace invites before judgment, and God's patience is meant to lead hearts toward alignment, not away from it. God is calling people to listen beyond noise, beyond opinion, beyond emotion, to that steady inner conviction that aligns with truth and reverence. When God speaks, the soul recognizes it, even if the mind resists it. That recognition is the doorway to obedience. God is reminding hearts that obedience today protects tomorrow, because decisions made in urgency shape outcomes that cannot be reversed. God speaks ahead of time because preparation preserves, and those who prepare walk in peace while others scramble in regret. This moment remains alive with invitation, because God does not withdraw the call lightly. As long as conviction stirs, the door remains open, and as long as the heart responds, restoration remains possible. God is faithful to complete what obedience begins, and those who respond now align themselves with a path marked by clarity, strength, and enduring peace that flows from reverence and surrender to God alone. There is a sobering truth within this alert that must be spoken plainly, because God does not awaken hearts merely to inspire them, but to prepare them. And preparation is evidence of love. A loving authority warns before danger, instructs before consequence, and calls before separation. And God's warning is never empty sound. It is a shield extended in advance. Those who dismiss preparation expose themselves to harm, not because God abandons them, but because they refuse the protection offered through obedience. God is addressing the tendency to spiritualize avoidance, because many cloak hesitation in language that sounds wise but is rooted in fear or pride. Waiting can be faith when God instructs it, but delay becomes disobedience when conviction is clear. God is not honored by hesitation that masquerades as discernment, because discernment leads to action, not paralysis. And wisdom responds when the path has been revealed. This alert also uncovers the danger of selective obedience, because partial alignment creates internal contradiction. God is not interested in fragments of surrender, because fragmented obedience fractures integrity, and integrity is the foundation of spiritual strength. When the heart withholds areas from God, those areas become sources of instability. And God is calling for wholeness, not performance. God is speaking to those who have grown cynical, because disappointment unresolved can harden expectation. Cynicism dulls hope, and hope deferred weakens motivation. But God restores hope by reestablishing trust. Trust is rebuilt through obedience in small steps, because each act of obedience becomes evidence that God is faithful and attentive. There is also a call here to spiritual maturity, because maturity discerns urgency without sensationalism. God is not calling for panic, but for seriousness, not frenzy, but focus. Emotional extremes distract from steady obedience, and God is restoring balance that allows hearts to act decisively without losing clarity. God is challenging the tendency to outsource responsibility, because transformation cannot be delegated. No one can obey on behalf of another, no one can surrender for someone else, and no one can respond to company inviction that was not given to them. God addresses individuals because accountability is personal, and personal response shapes collective outcomes. This alert also reveals the cost of comfort-driven living, because comfort numbs urgency. When comfort becomes the goal, truth becomes negotiable. And when truth becomes negotiable, alignment collapses. God is not cruel to disrupt comfort. God is merciful to prevent destruction, because comfort unchecked becomes captivity. God is restoring awareness of consequence, not to intimidate, but to clarify, because every decision carries weight. Obedience carries fruit. Disobedience carries loss. And neutrality is an illusion that evaporates under pressure. God is calling hearts to choose intentionally, because unchosen paths still lead somewhere. There is a refining happening within this alert, because urgency separates sincerity from sentiment. Many enjoy inspiration, but fewer embrace transformation, because transformation demands change. God refines faith by testing response, and response reveals what inspiration alone cannot. God is also speaking to those burdened by guilt, Because guilt unresolved becomes avoidance, and avoidance distances the heart further. God does not call people back to punish them, but to restore them. And restoration begins with honesty, not self-condemnation. God's correction lifts those who respond humbly. This moment carries instruction about stewardship of influence, because every life influences oath, heirs, whether acknowledged or not. God is calling people to live responsibly, knowing that obedience strengthens not only their own foundation, but also those connected to them. Private obedience produces public safety. God is reestablishing the seriousness of vows, promises, and commitments, because words spoken lightly weaken trust. God honors integrity of speech, because integrity reflects reverence. When promises are kept, alignment is reinforced, and when they are broken, confusion spreads. This alert also addresses spiritual laziness, because neglect is quieter than rebellion, but equally destructive over time. Neglect starves devotion, weakens discernment, and dulls conviction. God is calling people to intentional pursuit, because pursuit maintains connection, and connection sustains obedience. God is reminding hearts that faith grows through testing, not avoidance, because challenges reveal dependence. Those who run toward God in difficulty grow stronger, while those who retreat into self-reliance grow weary. God strengthens those who lean fully on divine wisdom. There is also a call to humility in learning, because teachability keeps the heart aligned. God resists arrogance, not out of offense, but because arrogance blocks instruction. A teachable heart remains adaptable, responsive, and alive to direction. God is awakening discernment regarding voices, because not every voice carries truth. Discernment is sharpened through reverence, not popularity, and God calls plea, to weigh what they hear against conviction, not convenience. Truth often confronts before it comforts. This alert speaks to the importance of discipline, because discipline preserves freedom. Without discipline, desire rules. And when desire rules, obedience weakens. God does not restrict joy through discipline. God protects joy by it, because unguarded desires lead to regret. God is also calling for reconciliation, because unresolved division drains strength. Peace restored brings clarity, and clarity strengthens obedience. God values unity rooted in truth, not harmony rooted in avoidance, because real unity requires honesty and humility. This moment also invites gratitude, because gratitude realigns perspective. A grateful heart recognizes provision, acknowledges guidance, and remains sensitive to direction. Gratitude protects against entitlement, and entitlement blinds the heart to urgency. God is pressing the reality that obedience shapes legacy, because what is lived today echoes beyond the present. Legacy is not built through intention alone, but through consistent alignment. And God is calling people to live with awareness that their choices matter beyond themselves. The alert continues to echo, because God continues to pursue. And pursuit reveals care that refuses to abandon. As long as the call resounds, opportunity remains. And as long as hearts are stirred, response is possible, because God is patient yet purposeful, gentle yet authoritative, merciful yet due. And the weight of this moment remains alive, calling for attentiveness, reverence, and decisive alignment with God's will now and without hesitation. There is a summons within this alert that reaches into the hidden places of motivation, because God is not only concerned with what is done, but why it is done. Actions without alignment may look righteous on the surface, yet remain hollow within, and God weighs the heart with precision that no human eye can match. God is calling people to purify intention, to remove the subtle desire for recognition, control, or self-preservation that contaminates obedience, because pure intention produces steady faith that does not collapse under pressure. God is also addressing impatience, because impatience reveals a struggle with trust. When trust weakens, urgency turns into anxiety. But God's urgency is not meant to agitate the soul, it is meant to anchor it. God calls people to act swiftly without acting rashly, to move decisively without moving blindly, because obedience guided by reverence remains steady even in uncertain terrain. This alert reaches into the realm of unseen battles, because many conflicts are not external but internal, fought in thoughts, desires, and silent choices. God equips those who respond with discernment to recognize when resistance is spiritual rather than circumstantial. Victory begins when the heart submits fully, because a submitted heart cannot be easily manipulated by fear, doubt, or deception. God is calling people to break agreement with lies they have unknowingly accepted. Lies that say change is impossible, that obedience is too costly, that alignment is unrealistic. These lies weaken resolve and normalize stagnation, but God's truth restores strength and exposes limitation as illusion. What God calls people to do, God also empowers them to accomplish. There is also a refining call to patience, not passive waiting, but active endurance. Endurance strengthens faith muscles that comfort never develops. God is teaching hearts to remain faithful when results are not immediate, because faith that depends on visible outcome is fragile. But faith anchored in trust remains firm even when progress seems slow. God is speaking to those who have confused activity with obedience, because constant motion does not equal alignment. Busyness can become a substitute for surrender, and productivity can mask avoidance. God is restoring simplicity, reminding hearts that obedience is often quieter than performance, yet far more powerful in its effect. This alert also confronts misplaced identity rooted in past failure or success. God does not define people by their worst mistakes or their greatest achievements. Both can become chains if they replace humility. God calls people to live from present obedience, not past labels, because renewal happens in the now, not in regret or nostalgia. God is awakening responsibility for spiritual atmosphere, because every life carries influence that shapes environments, words spoken, attitudes held, and choices made either release peace or tension. God is calling people to guard what they release into the world, because spiritual carelessness spreads quietly but powerfully. There is a reminder here that obedience often unfolds progressively. God rarely reveals the entire path at once, because trust grows step by step. Those who demand full visibility before moving remain stuck. But those who move with the light they have receive more light as they go. God honors movement rooted in trust. God is also confronting emotional dependency, because emotions fluctuate, but truth remains steady. When obedience depends on how one feels, consistency collapses. God calls people to anchor themselves in truth rather than mood, because maturity is revealed in faithfulness beyond feeling. This alert carries instruction about accountability, because isolation weakens discernment. God designed growth to occur in connection, where humility is practiced and correction is received. Accountability protects against self-deception and reinforces commitment to alignment. God is calling people to cultivate attentiveness, because subtle guidance requires quiet hearts. Noise crowds out conviction, and constant stimulation dulls perception. God is not absent in silence. God often speaks most clearly there, and those who learn to listen gain wisdom that cannot be taught. There is also a call to generosity of spirit, because clenched hearts resist. Flow. When fear controls resources, time, or compassion, stagnation follows. God invites trust, expressed through generosity, not as obligation, but as evidence of confidence in divine provision. God is reminding hearts that obedience refines character, and character sustains calling. Without character, calling becomes dangerous. God builds inwardly before expanding outwardly, because what is not rooted will not endure. This alert also speaks to resilience, because obedience will be tested. Resistance does not indicate error. It often confirms direction. God strengthens those who persevere, not by removing resistance immediately, but by increasing capacity to endure without compromise. God is pressing the truth that alignment is maintained daily. One moment of surrender does not replace continual attentiveness. Faith is lived, not stored, and obedience is renewed with each choice. God values daily faithfulness more than occasional intensity. There is an invitation here to trust God's timing without questioning God's intent. Timing delays can purify motive, deepen humility, and strengthen resolve. God never withholds without reason and never delays without purpose. God is calling people to recognize that reverence shapes response. When God is honored properly, obedience becomes natural, not forced. Reverence restores order within the soul, and order produces peace that remains stable under pressure. This alert continues to unfold because God continues to engage, and engagement is evidence of care. The stirring remains, the call persists. The invitation stands open, urging hearts to respond not out of fear, but out of trust, not out of pressure, but out of conviction, not out of obligation, but out of reverence for God, whose voice still echoes with urgency and purpose, calling those who are willing to listen, to align, to move, and to remain faithful as the moment continues to demand attention and response from every attentive heart, willing to submit fully to God's authority and direction without reservation or delay. There is a piercing clarity in this alert that exposes the difference between belief and surrender, because belief acknowledges God exists, but surrender acknowledges God reigns. Many have settled for belief without submission, comfort without obedience, inspiration without transformation. But God is calling for lives that are governed, not merely influenced. Governance requires yielding authority, and yielding authority requires trust that God's ways are higher, wiser, and ultimately life-giving, even when they confront personal preference. God is calling people to examine what governs their decisions when pressure arrives, because pressure reveals allegiance. When fear dictates choices, fear has authority. When desire dictates choices, desire has authority. When God dictates choices, alignment follows. This alert is God reclaiming rightful authority over decision-making, reminding hearts that true freedom is found not in self-rule, but in divine order. There is also a sobering reminder here that neutrality is not safety. Remaining undecided in moments of urgency is itself a decision, and indecision often favors deterioration. God does not call people to hover endlessly between conviction and comfort, because hesitation erodes resolve. God calls for decisive alignment, because clarity strengthens obedience and obedience stabilizes the soul. God is addressing the silent erosion of conscience, because conscience dulled by repeated compromise becomes unreliable. When conscience is ignored, discernment weakens, and when discernment weakens, deception gains access. God is restoring sensitivity to conscience, sharpening awareness so that right and wrong are no longer blurred by convenience or habit. This alert also reaches into the realm of hope deferred, because many have stopped expecting change after repeated disappointment. Hope deferred can quietly turn into resignation, and resignation kills expectancy. God is restoring expectancy, not through fantasy, but through renewed trust that obedience still produces fruit. Even after long seasons of waiting, God is reminding hearts that obedience is cumulative. Small acts of faithfulness compound over time, building spiritual strength that sudden trials cannot easily dismantle. Many underestimate the power of consistency, but God honors those who remain steady when no one is watching, because unseen obedience prepares hearts for visible responsibility. There is also a confrontation of spiritual pride, because pride resists correction and rejects urgency. Pride assumes exemption, believing warnings are for others. God humbles pride not to destroy, but to rescue, because pride isolates, but humility restores connection. Those who humble themselves remain reachable when God speaks. God is calling people to re-examine their relationship with truth, because truth ignored becomes truth resisted. When truth is resisted, self-deception follows, and self-deception is one of the most dangerous conditions of the soul. God is restoring love for truth, not as information, but as alignment that shapes life. This alert speaks to stewardship of thought, because unchecked thoughts shape behavior. God calls people to guard their inner dialogue, because repeated thoughts become beliefs, and beliefs become actions. Alignment begins in the mind, where truth must be allowed to challenge false narratives that have gone unquestioned. God is also addressing comparison, because comparison distorts calling. When people measure themselves against others, obedience becomes conditional. God does not call hearts to compete, but to comply, because destiny is individual and alignment cannot be outsourced or borrowed. There is a renewed call to simplicity, because complexity often hides avoidance. God's instructions are rarely complicated, but they do require courage. Simplicity exposes what must be done, and courage enables it to be carried out. God is stripping away unnecessary layers so that obedience becomes unmistakable. God is reminding hearts that obedience produces clarity even before it produces comfort. Comfort may follow later, but clarity comes immediately. When a decision aligns with God, confusion lifts, even if circumstances remain challenging. That clarity is confirmation that alignment has occurred. This alert also highlights the danger of nostalgia, because longing for former seasons can blind hearts to present instruction. God does not call people backward, but forward. And while gratitude for the past is healthy, living there is disobedience. God speaks in the present tense, because obedience is always now. God is calling people to recognize that faithfulness does not mean absence of struggle. Struggle often accompanies obedience, but struggle endured with trust strengthens resolve. God does not promise ease, but presence, and presence sustains those who remain aligned under pressure. There is an exposure here of misplaced guilt, because some carry guilt that God never imposed. False guilt paralyzes obedience, convincing hearts they are unworthy to respond. God removes false guilt through truth, restoring confidence that obedience is still possible and still welcomed. God is also restoring awareness of sacred time, because not every moment carries the same weight. There are appointed moments when responsiveness matters more than preparation, and this alert marks such a time. Missing sacred moments leads to unnecessary delay, but recognizing them accelerates alignment. This alert continues to press, because God's desire is not partial correction, but full restoration. God does not mend symptoms while leaving roots untouched. God addresses foundations, because strong foundations sustain long-term faithfulness. God is inviting hearts to renew covenantal seriousness, to treat obedience not as an occasional act, but as a way of life. When obedience becomes habitual, peace becomes stable, discernment becomes sharp, and faith becomes resilient. The stirring remains intentional, the urgency remains measured, and the call remains clear, because God is still speaking, still inviting, still calling hearts out of delay and into alignment, not through fear-driven alarm, but through truth-driven urgency that insists this moment matters, this response matters, and reverent obedience remains the safest and wisest path for every heart that dares to listen and move in alignment with God now. Now hear this with the full weight of your soul, because this moment is not passing you by accidentally, and this stirring is not emotional coincidence. It is the nearness of God pressing upon conscience, inviting response while the heart is still tender. God is standing at the center of this moment, not as a distant observer, but as a present authority calling hearts to rise from delay, to step out of spiritual sleep, and to choose alignment over excuse. This is the hour to stop measuring life by comfort and begin measuring it by obedience, because obedience is the language God responds to with power, clarity, and peace. Let this be the moment when honesty replaces avoidance, when reverence replaces routine, when surrender replaces control. Examine your life without defensiveness and without fear, because God already sees everything and still calls you forward. Lay down what has weakened your spirit, release what has divided your loyalty, and return fully. Not halfway, not cautiously, but wholeheartedly. God does not require perfection to begin, only humility to respond. Renew your purpose by renewing your posture before God. Stand upright in conviction, steady in obedience, and anchored in trust. Let reverence shape your choices. Let truth govern your thoughts, and let alignment define your direction. Do not wait for ideal conditions, because obedience creates conditions where favor flows and strength rises. God honors movement born from trust more than hesitation disguised as wisdom. Walk closer now, not later, not someday, but now, with intentional steps and a listening heart. Let every decision echo reverence. Let every action reflect alignment, and let every day become an offering of faithfulness. God is faithful to those who respond, attentive to those who return, and near to those who call with sincerity and awe. May this moment mark a turning, a realignment, a return to clarity, courage, and purpose, as you choose reverence over resistance, obedience over delay, and truth over comfort, standing fully awake, fully aligned, and fully committed before God.